Promotional support is provided by Hippo Campus Magazine. The 2018 Remember in November contest for creative nonfiction is still open for submissions until July 15th. The annual contest has a grand prize of $1,000 and publication for all finalists. That is cool. Visit hippocampusmagazine.com for details. Hippo Campus Magazine, memorable creative nonfiction. And this is the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, a show where I speak to the best artists about telling true stories, where we dig into origins, work habits, and process so you can be a better storyteller. For episode 105, I welcome Jonathan Green, author of Sex, Money, Murder, a story of crack, blood, and betrayal, to the show. But before I get to that, and I deeply apologize for Jonathan for this, but I feel like I need to give this little bit of news. The past couple of shows I've teased that our dog Smarty wasn't doing so well. This past Wednesday, just 2 days ago, as of this publication, we had to put him to sleep. We had exhausted every means to keep him comfortable and happy. Lots of tests to try to find out exactly what was wrong, to find out what was treatable, if anything was treatable, given his advanced age. And like I said, we had exhausted everything. So I finally had to pick up his weak, powerless, cancer-filled body and bring him to the vet. He had a nice long life full of hiking, walking, treats, food, good vet care, the best beds a dog could sleep on. He died at about age 14. We miss him so much, and the house is eerily quiet. We lost both our dogs within 18 months of each other, so we're just going to take care of ourselves and do the things that having a dog sometimes prevents you from doing and go from there. So thank you very much for hearing me out on that. I appreciate it. I know it's not the happiest thing, but you can't talk about a sick dog for a couple episodes and not, bring it home, so to speak. So how do you segue from that to Jonathan Green's wonderful book and inspiring interview? Well, Jonathan's story of how he became a journalist is, like I said, inspiring, in that he didn't have the traditional route. So in this episode, we talk a lot about his origin, his process of using recorders versus a notebook, making that extra call, forming relationships and sources, and garnering that trust, and much, much more. If you're not already subscribed to the show, please head over to Apple Podcasts, Google Play Music, or Stitcher. Soon to be Spotify, I hope, but we'll see. And subscribe so you can get this into your feed every Friday. So that's it, CNFers. Enjoy this show. Thanks for listening. Here's episode 105. So what is your backstory of getting into journalism and telling true stories?
Well, I had a rather unorthodox path. I mean, I started writing for local newspapers when I was 18 and straight out of school, really. And I left school with not many qualifications, so I did a whole range of factory jobs and things like that. And I wrote in my spare time. I mean, I used to write in the evenings. And originally, I wanted to be a music journalist. So I started writing about bands that came and played in our area. And, those pieces got published in a small local newspaper. And then I managed to get some things sort of published in a regional. And then from there, I just, started sort of freelancing a lot more, and ended up with a staff job on a magazine in London called The Big Issue. And that's when I really started to work on social orientated journalism, and I started to edge into sort of human rights stuff and that type of thing. And then it was a progression into crime and other things later on,
Yeah. What were some of your early growing pains as you were looking to, earn your chops as a reporter?
Growing pains. Gosh, that's a very good question. I mean, I think just learning how to tell stories. I mean, there's a very, classic sort of local newspaper way of telling stories where you straight report the facts. But I was always interested in, longer pieces, and it was always the story behind the headlines that I found more intriguing than just breaking news. That was never my thing, really. So I started to sort of play around with longer pieces, and I just really enjoyed the kind of freedom of that.
What were some of the conversations you were having maybe with your editors as you were looking to try to stretch your legs and try to get beyond just the headlines?
Well, it was always, for example, I mean, when I was working on The Big Issue in London, I mean, I wanted to do a piece on these sort of camps in the UK. There were people sort of coming over from Europe, and they were pretty much, I mean, like it was like sort of slave labor, really. I mean, people were paid very sort of small amounts of money, and they lived in very, very bad conditions. So, I managed to convince an editor to let me work undercover at like one of these things. So I did that, and I wrote a story about it. So it was always trying to convince editors, to let me do sort of crazy stuff, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that can be a fun and maddening bargaining thing, I imagine. They don't want to necessarily waste the resources, but like in order to get to the real crux of the story, it's like you got to make the deep dive, and so sometimes that's a hard thing to sell, I imagine.
Yeah, but I started to have success at it. I mean, I remember doing a piece on outlaw motorcycle gangs in Scandinavia, and I managed to convince sort of GQ magazine to send me out there and to write about that. And and I think once you get one or two of these pieces sort of under your belt, and people can see that like you can operate in foreign countries, even though Scandinavia was not that far from London at the time, I think you start to make a reputation for it, and then I think people start to take you more sort of seriously. But I think, as you say, it's sort of trial and error in the beginning, because you never quite know what's going to happen on these assignments. And I remember once I did a piece on cockfighting in the Deep South, and managed to so which is a felony, and we managed to get into an illegal cockfight on the Texas-Oklahoma border, and the guy I was working with got spotted as a photographer, and we got sort of marched out, and I think the last people who investigated a ring like that was left in the trunk of a car in the Louisiana bayou. So it was particularly scary being marched out of there, and there are all sorts of shady guys there, and they told us to leave in no uncertain terms, and we were just amazed that so we'd escaped a beating, really. Yeah. But we got out of there and we made it back, and I'd managed to keep hold of my notebook, although they took all the photographer's film and everything. So, that's one of those cases where like you get the story, but at the time, you're never quite sure which way things are going to go,
In a situation like that, how are you taking notes so you're not sort of busted?
Yeah, I mean, I got really used to sort of, using small kind of notepads and keeping them, in my sort of pocket, and then using the bathroom a lot and just sort of scribbling down conversations or things of note, and then coming back again and trying to hold as much as I could in my head, and then, scribbling on the side. And I got so used to working like that, really, for quite some time.
Yeah, this raises the question of access and trust, and whether it's the getting into these a cockfighting ring or the biker gangs in Scandinavia. So What were some of those initial steps in these stories of how you were able to maybe get a foot in the door of those underworlds so you can get in there and witness it?
Yeah, I mean, it's just a lot of calls. It's like you really have to sort of call around and email and see who's willing to talk, and then you work through a series of sort of stages to get to the people that you need to talk to. I mean, I found that. I mean, I did quite a lot of sort of stories in London about organized crime, and most of my best sort of crime contacts came through police officers who were, very sort of skeptical of journalists. But once you win their trust, then I think a whole landscape sort of opens up, and they sort of generally know who all the bad guys are, and they oftentimes, I mean, they're on sort of speaking terms with them, So through that, I was able to get access to a sort of counterfeiter in London who counterfeited money for drug gangs, and I was able to meet with him a number of times. I sort of wrote a story about him. I was able to meet people who steal cars for a living. I mean, I got that, and the cockfighting story in the South, I think I went through some websites online for people involved in that type of thing. And I think, the most important thing in winning people's trust is just to be completely straight up with them. I mean, you have to be completely honest from the get-go so that people realize that, they can trust you.
Yeah, this is for me certainly, and I suspect for others, kind of a foreign concept of this type of reporting and relationship building. So you'll pardon me if I ask some pretty very rudimentary or boring questions with respect to this, because I'd love to know what maybe some of those conversations are like when you're not necessarily reporting a story, but you are just calling to say, hey, what's going on? Got any news for me? Or, what those things are, what those conversations are like when you're not like, at the moment writing a story. Yeah.
Well, the most important thing I think is never to start to pull out your notepad until you absolutely know that things are okay. So, I just made sure. I mean, the first thing I would never do is pull out a notepad or a tape recorder until everything had been established, and then you just sort of chat in general terms about things, and things that you might have sort of a mutual interest in, without talking about sort of stuff that's going to get anyone into any hot water. I mean, it's not quite small talk, which I'm really bad at anyway. But it's more just getting to know each other, and people oftentimes they have a lot of questions about you, who you are. People are very intrigued with journalism and writing and how it works, and they often have this misconception that everyone's a millionaire, like who's a writer and all their stuff,
Yeah.
I think you just have to show that, that you're like them. I mean, I think actually what really helped me is after school, as I said, I mean, I worked a whole load of really dead-end jobs. I mean, I worked in factories. I worked as a forklift truck driver. I was a garbage man. So I always felt that, I'd sort of seen life from many, many angles, and I feel I sort of, understand people in some sense who have to turn to sort of alternative ways of making a living. I mean, I know the sort of drudgery of a dead end job, and I'm very sympathetic to people like you have to, live a life like that to feed their family. So lots and lots of empathy. Never judge people, always avoid that if you can. I mean, it's hard, depending on who you're sort of talking to, but, try to avoid that,
Yeah, because I think a lot of sources, a lot of people, their hackles and defenses go up when they approach or are approached by a journalist. So if you can come at them and be like, "Oh, I'm a human, and I'm recognizing that you're a human as well," and you talk about soccer or their family for a little bit, not get too chummy, but at least show that you're people trying to find your own way.
Exactly. And I think, so many times people have preconceptions of what a journalist is because, not many people have met one. I remember sort of meeting a police officer in Maine, and we'd had this whole back and forth over the phone and email, and we eventually met. And, for some reason, I think he thought I was some very snooty guy, probably because of my accent, I should say. And he was absolutely amazed that I would drink a beer with him. That he said, "Really? You drink beer?" I said, "Sure, I have a beer." And it's sort of breaking down all these barriers.
Yeah, of course. That's brilliant. It's kind of, I think I read something that Howard Bryant, who's a prominent sports writer for ESPN, and written several books. And I think in the acknowledgments of one of his books, it might be his latest, the Heritage, which is an amazing book. He, oftentimes it's like when the recorder's off or the notebook goes away, and then they're hanging out for 10 or 15 minutes with a manager of the Giants or something, and they're just chit chatting. And that is where that little 15 or 20 minute investment in a little conversation that is authentic can actually yield lots of fruit, maybe months or years from then.
Oh yeah. And also, I always find that as soon as you switch off the tape recorder, you say, "Okay, thanks a lot." That's the end of the interview. People really open up and they start to say all the stuff that you hope that they would sort of say in the interview. So I've gotten really used to, over the years, turning off the tape recorder and then opening up my notepad, because I know what's coming next in the small talk is that all the best material is about to come. I mean, I think that the tape recorder can be a real sort of impediment to getting people to open up. And I remember, I think there was an essay by Gay Talese about how the tape recorder was like the sort of death of modern journalism, because as soon as it's there, because there's a presence in the room, and people sort of withdraw. So again, I got really used to scribbling tons of notes really fast, which is why my sort of handwriting now is illegible probably, but yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad you brought up recorders in this context. This is a fun conversation I love to have with people about it, because there are so many. There's there's a hard and fast two schools of thought on it. There are the Talese, McPhee, Lillian Ross, the people who totally swear that nope, they are intrusive. They are, despite the fact that they gather everything, they are not selective because they're taking everything. On the other side of that coin is because, if I'm taking notes, sometimes I can't even remember or read what I've written, and then I lose all that great material. And I know I know that the recording is catching everything, and I can transcribe it and get it word for word, get it 100% accurate. So I tend to lean towards recording. It's just a great tool for me anyway. So how did you find your balance with it?
Well, there were times when people were very uncomfortable with it, but there were other times too. I mean, on Sex, Money, Murder, and I did, literally thousands and thousands of hours of interviews. And there was one time I think I was with Shug, and he said, "JG, stop." And I said, "So what is it?" He said, "JG, you haven't even turned the tape recorder on." I'm like, "Oh, God, thank you, Shug." so he'd gotten so used to being recorded that, he noticed, before me, that we didn't have the recorder in the middle of the table. So, but obviously, you have to reach a point with people where they're sort of comfortable with that and stuff. And he loved it. I mean, he loved having a recorder there. Other people don't, So I think a lot of it's just sort of reading your subjects and just making sure people are comfortable, with however you choose to document them.
Yeah, it kind of. I think John Krakauer in the New Journalism, when he was interviewed in Boynton's book, there he kind of likens all these tools that a journalist can use as kind of like a photographer taking out different lenses. They're maybe for Shug or for other people, they're totally comfortable with a recorder, so why not use it? But maybe there are other people who clam up. It's like, all right, well now, notebook, scribble, do what you can with that, because that's going to be the tool to effectively have the best conversation with so-and-so, because they'll clam up if they see the red light on the recorder. So yeah, it's just about being flexible.
Yes, exactly. But I sort of find it's hard that once you have people on edge, it's very hard to sort of pull them back again. So I think those initial sort of meetings are really important. So I'll always ask, are you sort of comfortable with a tape recorder? And if they say no, I say fine. I'll write notes. But then, yes, I mean, then it's hard to sort of capture everything they say and the nuance and all the rest of it. It sort of makes your job a lot harder. But sometimes you have to work like that,
Yeah. Yeah. And then there's the beast of transcribing hours and hours of tape. So,
oh, yeah, which is our least favorite job, I think. I think all our sort of journalists are the same. No one likes transcribing their interviews because you're always horrified at, why didn't I ask that? They gave you a perfect opportunity and you missed the question,
Yeah. Yeah. That's the thing, too. And I think that's why McPhee and Talese and all them, if you're scribbling constantly, it makes you you feel a bit more engaged, and you might have the right follow-up, or you fall behind because you're like 3 sentences behind what they're actually saying because you're scribbling down something they said 10 seconds ago as they keep going. So it's like you miss an opportunity to follow up sometimes. It's weird. It's a weird thing. And you've been doing this a while. I've been doing it not as long, but a little while, and it's still kind of trips me up a bit. I wish there was just one way to do it, and that's it.
I know, like me too. But the other thing I find with notes, and the sort of barrier I think with scribbling notes, is you have your head down and you're looking at your notepad. And I find, if you really want to get the sort of trust of the people that you're interviewing, you really have to make eye contact a lot, Mm-hmm. And so I find that oftentimes, like, the notepad can be more of a sort of barrier to winning the trust than the tape recorder is. It all depends,
It really does. And there's the other side of it too, where if they see you scribbling, it kind of looks like you're working, and they're like, oh yeah, they're getting it all down, and but it doesn't look as passive. Be like, oh yeah, there they are. They're scribbling like hell, like they're really capturing what I'm saying. But then maybe with the recorder, if you're just kind of sitting there holding that up near them and you're just kind of nodding, there could be a tendency to glaze over and not look like you're listening because the recorder is capturing everything. So it's definitely a weird dance you got to play.
Absolutely, definitely.
So what I found really poignant about what you said is, like, coming out of high school, and you worked a lot of these very working class jobs, and you always had your eye on being a writer. And I wonder, where did that seed of wanting to become a writer come in, and how did you keep that as the light at the end of your tunnel while you were working on factory lines and in garbage trucks?
Yeah, I mean, well, it was probably the only thing I could really do well at school was write, and I flunked almost everything, but in English I always got A grades and things like that. I mean, I think from a very sort of early age, my parents always encouraged reading, and we had a house full of books. So, I was reading from an early age and just devoured books. I mean, just read and read and read. And, loved the written word and stories and imagination. And, just felt it was about the only thing I really had an interest in. So, when I left school with nothing, and all my sort of friends were off at university and having enormous fun, just at these great parties and stuff. And I was working in a meat factory and an apple factory, and, really pretty sort of down in the dumps, and I turned to books as I always did. So, I used to read a lot of Dostoevsky, and there's a fantastic English writer, J.G. Ballard. And at that time in England, there was a lot of exciting writing with music. And there were a lot of very cool magazines at the time. There was The Face, which, really sort of captured sort of dance culture and warehouse parties and all that stuff. So, I think books were always my salvation and my escape, particularly from factory life. I mean, like you're working these terrible jobs. And I remember standing next to one guy on a line. I mean, he was like 65, and I think he'd sort of served in the Navy. And all of a sudden he started to tear up a little bit. And I said, "So what's wrong?" And he said, standing here day after day after day, putting these things in a box, I live on the memories of my life. I mean, that's how I managed to keep going. Oh. And I've just realized I've run out of memories. I have no more memories I can keep replaying to overcome the tedium of this job, and it struck such a chord with me, because if you're, reasonably intelligent and bright, standing on a production line in a factory is like a slow death. I mean, it really is. It's like a jail sentence, but so many people have to work these jobs. So, I was just determined that I was going to break out of this mold. And, I'd read so much about foreign correspondence, and so people roaming all over the world and, finding out about what the world was really like, that it just sort of lit a fire in me that, either I was going to stay on the factory line or I was going to break out. So then I just started to write with sort of, I was more earnest, and I was more impassioned about having my stuff published, and really that was very, very pushy, but sort of not in a rude way, but just sort of, kept submitting pieces and just wouldn't take no for an answer. And it was sort of funny, really, because a lot of my friends who'd been to some, very smart universities and studied English literature and, really had a great time studying all that stuff, they sort of found it really hard to get jobs in journalism. But by the time they came out of university, I was sort of reasonably well established as a journalist, so.
That's amazing. Some people, when they have a day job of that nature, can use it as a way of hiding from wanting to do the work that they feel most passionate for. It can be a crutch. It can be a paycheck, and it's hard to sometimes leave that comfort. So how did you structure your days around that day job so that you didn't feel trapped and ultimately did get out and get off the line?
Well, I got very used to using every negative experience in my life as something to write about. So I remember I had a job working on a garbage truck, and I actually liked that job because it was outdoors and, you'd be in the sort of countryside, picking up garbage. And I wrote a piece about it, just about what it was like to work as a garbage man. And it got published in The Independent, which in England, in the late 80s was the newspaper. I mean, it was very avant-garde. People loved The Independent. I mean, it was sort of started to break the mold of sort of fusty old sort of English national newspaper. So I published that, and that sort of, then because that became a sort of calling card. So when you approached editors, you could say, look, here's a piece I wrote in The Independent. I mean, it wasn't a particularly ambitious sort of piece of journalism, but it was a nice tight sort of 800 words about the sort of humor of working on a garbage truck. So that helped. And then later on, when I was living in London, and there was one time I was beaten up really badly by some skinheads in a pub. And I was with a friend of mine. I mean, it was a hugely sort of traumatic experience. I mean, real raw violence, And I approached Esquire magazine. I said, "Hey, would you like a piece about what it's like to really get to beaten up by skinheads?" And they said, "Yes, please." So I wrote a 2,000-word piece, and I put some statistics in there that, like if you're a sort of male aged between 18 and 24, then your sort of chances of being beaten up outside a pub are quite high, and, it's quite sort of common. But I wrote a sort of very graphic piece about that. And, that then sort of got me going like with Esquire in London. And they thought, well, like if this guy can withstand a beating like that, then he can do sort of lots of other challenging assignments. So that's when I, started doing, I took part in a very fast sort of car race and started doing crime stuff. I mean, anything that really had an edge and that was a little raw, that's really sort of how I made my name in London at that time. But it always sort of started with some sort of negative experience that I would sort of put into words,
There's that line of, life can't imitate art or art can't imitate life unless you have a life. And so it's like by bypassing university, it was, a way that put you in touch with real people and real experiences, real gritty stuff. And you had the writer sensibility. And so you had this weird access to the working class and what that experience is like, and then you had the skill to be able to shape that into something that was evocative and moving.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't sort of always easy. I mean, to turn these sort of things into stuff that people actually want to read about. I mean, like you certainly have to sort of finesse the material, to make it sort of compelling. But I love sort of writers like George Orwell, was a huge inspiration in his book, Down and Out in Paris and London. I mean, it was all about street life and homelessness. And, my first sort of big job on a magazine, that was on a magazine in London called The Big Issue. And it was sold by homeless people. And it was a way for these sort of homeless people to make some money on their own and to get a sort of leg up in life. So, I was really drawn to that stuff, sort of giving voice to the working class or people who didn't really have a sort of, had a very challenging circumstances. So I always felt quite sort of empathetic to people like that.
Did a big chunk of your motivation in your writing and your journalism come from the fact that, like, if it didn't work, like, you would be back on that line again? Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it was always a fear. It absolutely, it was my worst fear that if I didn't succeed at this, because I had no kind of safety net and I didn't have a degree, so I didn't have anything to like fall back on. So if it went wrong, there'd be nowhere else I could go but down, down, down. Mm-hmm. So I think that really sort of fired me up. I mean, a lot of people I knew tried sort of freelancing and just sort of found it really tough. And my answer always was, well, it's nowhere near as tough as having to turn up 8 to 5 every day and stand on a production line in a factory. This is a far better life, even if you have 10 rejections, but as long as you have enough money to sort of pay your rent, then it's better. So, yeah, I was always afraid that I'd have to go back there,
Yeah. And in terms of the work and the writing and the research itself, I'm always interested to see how a particular artist defines rigor and tenacity. So I'd extend it to you. Like, what did hard work look like with your journalism and your writing?
Well, I think I was always sort of taught by these very old school reporters. I mean, like another one of my first jobs was writing about the sort of magistrates' courts in London. And, this was back in the day when like we used to smoke, like when we wrote. So, I got used to using a manual typewriter and smoking. But there was always sort of wisdom around these, smoky rooms in newspapers. And, people would always say, just make one more call, even if it's, you think you have the story and it's there, just make one or two more calls on it. Or if you think you're just about to like give up on a particular story, just make that extra call. So, sort of like a marathon runner's always like, okay, I just have to get past this last, few miles. I always felt I just had to make those extra phone calls. So I try to apply that to sort of everything I did as a writer, but I'd always make that sort of extra call. I'd always try to meet people face to face, not just like depend on the phone or email. So I just try to be more sort of rigorous in the way I was reaching out to people and, getting people to talk with you,
And making that extra calls, that's a skill unto itself, learning to not be so trapped by your own introversion to like go out and make that extra one, because that could be a lead domino to a whole nother subset of things worth doing, or it might just circle you right back to everything you already knew and you're done. So also, once you get good at it, maybe the trap is I'm just going to keep making calls, and then you never stop your research, and then you never get to the writing. So when do you know you're done?
It's always really hard because I never feel I'm done. I always feel I, need to add more. But I think, like with the magazine article, I'd always over research them, and I do with books too. I over research, and then it's a case of, sitting down with this mound of research and making kind of sense of it. And I think once you've exhausted every possibility and you're satisfied, like you've exhausted every possibility, I think is when okay, now I can write,
That's tough, especially for the titanic works of research and reporting. It's hard to keep things straight if you're not super organized by your very nature. So how do you keep things straight and organized so then eventually you can take the thousands of hours of tape that you had for Sex, Money, Murder and then start to make sense of it and tell a story?
Well, I think with that, it's sort of using chronology to your advantage. So I knew once I'd worked out who the four main characters was getting into their life story right from the beginning all the way to where we are now. So a lot of that material didn't make it in to the book, but it helped me understand the characters, sort of really well. And I wanted to be able to tell a story that was, entirely inside the point of view of the characters. That's how I wanted this book to really go. So, it was really just a case of starting to go right from, particularly with the guys in the gang, going right from, okay, so what are your earliest memories of Soundview and what was it like as a kid? And, what interactions did you have with each other when you were really young? And just sort of constantly building on that to build up a whole chronological time scale. And then in amongst that, you go back again when there's certain key parts of their story that are really useful to what you're trying to tell as a narrative, and then you explode those. Let you go back and you say, okay, well, can you remember the sort of tone of voice that person used, or their facial expression, or so what were they wearing? And and you can't get in to those minutiae questions until you have a rough idea of the narrative and how it's going to work in the actual book. So, it's quite painstaking, and, it really depends on the sort of goodwill of the people you're interviewing, and I make it clear from the beginning. I say, look, I'm not really like a sort of normal journalist in that, we're just going to have one or two conversations and that's it. You have to get used to speaking with me a lot and all the time. So eventually what happened is these guys sort of loved it so much. I mean, it was hard in the beginning and no one had ever asked them about their families or growing up. But then they started to call me and they said, yo, JG, you were talking like the other day, and I just, that time when I was 8 and we stole the bicycles in Sandview, I just wanted to like tell you about that. So I got very used to just having the phone on all the time and always having a notepad or always having the ability to record the call, and just having these snippets of stuff that became, fantastic in the book in the end because they were off the cuff, and it wasn't me pulling it out. It was somebody saying, look, this was a really important part of my life and I want to make sure that you understand it.
And how do you get comfortable asking even the most mundane of questions? Like, for instance, what was the tone of voice or the facial expressions? Those are things that, if you're witness to it, you don't have to ask. But if you're not witness, as you were for all the events of this book, you basically recreated the entire thing. You do have to make it read like fiction. You do have to get those little details. So yeah, I suspect that my experience has been like some people roll their eyes like, why the hell do you want to know that? Like, oh, yeah. But it's like, yeah, what were they wearing? Did they push their glasses up the bridge of their nose? Like what, those little things. Like, so how did you get comfortable with asking those little mundane questions?
Always apologize first. And they said, JT, you have to stop apologizing. It's because you're English, is it? I said, yeah, I guess. And they'd laugh and they'd say, look, no, it's fine. Like you've already explained that we're going to sort of work on these scenes and we understand. So, Pike was amazing. I mean, he would remember things. And I'd say, well, what about this? And he'd think, and so he'd say it and then he'd circle back and say, no, hold on. I mean, that's not right. And sometimes they'd go and check. So they'd call other gang members or someone else in the family and say, hey, like, you remember that time when? Is this what happened? And, and so we sort of corroborate it that way too. So, it just became part of the process, really.
Right. And when starting any book with heroes or anti-heroes and villains or whatever, or whatever character you start a book or a TV show with, I think naturally the reader or the viewer is going to kind of hook into that person. And even if they're unsavory and bad, they end up becoming sort of likable despite their villainy, if you will. Like I'm thinking of Breaking Bad and everything. And you start this book like Shug's the main character to start the book. So like, how did you decide to start with, say, like the gang members versus maybe law enforcement? Like, what was that decision making like?
Well, there was a very key turning point in the book for all the main characters in the book, and that was the shooting on Thanksgiving. And, the person at the heart of that was Shug, because he's the one who carried out the murder. So it was easy then to say, okay, so this is the guy whose head we have to be in when the book starts, and what does his world look like? Where was he standing? Okay, so he's standing on the roof, so what do you see off the roof? And then what was going on through his head? I mean, I think most people have a sort of basic question of, if you're about to commit a murder, what's so going on in your mind? Like, why are you doing it? So, I think these are, sort of natural curiosity helps you kind of set up the book in a way, because I think the material presents itself to you. And, I think it's, it was easy to make a decision then. And of course, it's all, it's all about stakes. Like who has the most at stake in this scene? And Shug at that point in the book had the most at stake. If he failed in what he was doing, then he might be killed himself. So it's really life or death stuff. I mean, literally. So I think that was an obvious sort of place to sort of start the narrative. And it was also, a key turning point, because after that murder was when the feds became involved, and, like my other sort of characters started moving and revolving around those scenes. So I thought that was an obvious way to sort of start the book.
How did you get to a point where you saw them as maybe humans and not monsters, if that makes any sense? Like, you kind of maybe divorce their crimes from the people that they are.
Well, I mean, I always give people the benefit of the doubt. So even before we met, I tried to sort of purge myself of any preconceptions, which is not always easy, but that's what I try and do with every interview I do as a sort of journalist. Don't have any preconceived notions, and that's surprisingly hard to sort of get rid of in yourself. But certainly when I first met Shug and Pipe, I wanted to know them not as sort of criminals or gang members or like what they'd done, but as human beings. People who'd been very raised in a very tough environment, lots of poverty, crime, and everything in our lives that we experience molds who we are. I mean, certainly my experiences working in a factory sort of molded me, and I tried to use those sort of negative experiences as a way to better myself. But that's not always easy. I mean, I think for Shug and Pipe were raised in a very tough environment, and I think I could understand why people would get involved in a gang and the fast money of drugs, when the only other opportunity is dead end jobs which pay small amounts of money, which I'd done myself. So I wanted to just sort of understand them as sort of people, and I felt by doing that, I think that's what my readers would be most interested in. I mean, I think it's always personalities and strong characters really make great books, and that was how I wanted to approach it all.
Was there ever a challenge in tone that you didn't want to glorify things that were unsavory in the book based on the charisma of your main characters?
Yes, I mean, I was, I never ever wanted to sort of glorify like what they'd done. I mean, like you love the man and not the sins, and because a lot of the stuff when we started to get really in to it was so violent and so so against sort of like many of the things I sort of stand for. I mean, I'd spent years doing human rights sort of journalism and writing about victims of sort of murderous regimes, so like my first book, Murder in the High Himalaya. So I certainly wasn't about to say it was cool or anything like that. And I think in the end, they started with some bravado, but then when we spoke about this stuff, it was very matter of fact. And Pipe would say, well, look, I had to carry out this act because being in a gang and a hierarchy, if I hadn't, then like my own life would be at risk. So then you start to sort of understand it, and like you understand why the violence occurs. And I think a big part was trying to get past these sort of taboos about violence and understanding it.
And so how did you arrive at this story, and then, as we were talking about access earlier, get such incredible access to these main players in your book?
Well, I think that you can't sort of force anyone as a sort of journalist. I mean, you can't force people to sort of talk with you because you have sort of no leverage in that sense. Like you have to have people who want to talk with you, who want to sort of tell you these things. And Sugar and Pipe had approached John O'Malley, so one of the main characters on the law enforcement side, and they said, look, we'd really like to sort of tell our story, like we're tired of being called snitches, and we want people to really understand why we did what we did. And I think as soon as you have people who are ready to talk with you, like you don't have to sort of tease it out of people. People want to talk, and these are the people that but you want to be writing about.
And at what point did you get turned on to this story and realized what potential was there?
Well, the potential was hard to see. I mean, it's like, I think any of these books, it's like you have a massive sort of ball of twine, and there's like multiple strings, and like you have to sort of tease each of these kinds of strings out to see where it's going to lead. And I think sitting down with Sugar and Pipe and understanding their lives and the violence, and then how these crucial acts in their lives, like murders or the formation of the gang, how that works against the backdrop of what was happening in society on a wider level. So, the late 1980s, early 1990s was the crack epidemic, and that led to a homicide epidemic, and New York was really sort of struggling with these murders. But then, the FBI and these other organizations were really focused on the mafia, and there was a sort of underlying racist theme where people weren't sort of investigating. They were sort of investigating murders in the housing projects, but they weren't making any headway. But those were the things that were driving the sort of sky high homicide rate in the city. So then I had sort of context, then you had a reason to understand law enforcement and what they were doing and what their mission was. So I think when you start out, you're looking for the imperative that all your main characters have, and that they have a sort of problem basically that they want to solve. So Sugar and Pipe, didn't have money, so they wanted money. So that was their problem. How did they solve it? O'Malley and Porcelli saw all these homicides in the Bronx at the time. How do we stop the killing? So like that was their problem to solve. And then these four characters all converge, and that's obviously like the basis of really good nonfiction, when everyone sort of meets. So I think that's when I started to get, okay, so this could be a book,
Jill Leovy, I think I'm pronouncing her name right. She wrote the review in the New York Times about your book, and she wrote at one point that one senses at points that Green wants to reach for novelistic flourishes, but he's restrained by better impulses. The book reconstructs events long past, and Green is bound by the available sources, mainly investigative records and interviews with members of the gang. Rather than try to compensate for the material he's missing, he bets on plain language and diligent documentation, and allows his sources' unfiltered remembrances to take center stage. So when you read that, was what did you think when you read that, and how did you arrive at the approach to the actual structuring of the narrative and the writing of the book?
Well, I read that and was like, God, she really understands my work, and how challenging it was, because, there's so many times in real life when, like you had this scene and, it's about to get really good, but then real life happens and everything tones down and it becomes monotonous again. And, really with writing about gangs, I mean, so much of it is sort of tedious and kind of boring. I mean, standing on the block and, various sort of feuds start with other people and then they don't lead anywhere. so there's lots of that stuff that you have to listen to and understand it. And if if it's important to something that happens later on, then you have to include it to show, how your sort of character is evolving and coming to different realizations. So, in the end, I just found that the material was so strong and compelling, but I didn't need to sort of finesse it much, because just the stark reality of it was enough. So I think to sort of state it in very sort of bleak terms, a lot of the time as a writer, is more powerful than sort of overwriting and, trying to pull out a greater sort of meaning of things as they happen than they really are. I mean, we all want to write scenes and say, well, this happened and then this sort of made him the sort of person he is and all the rest of it. But so much of our lives is just, small things happen and, we don't know really how they affect us, but maybe sort of later on they do. So because I'd sort of charted pretty much these guys' sort of whole lives, so when they were kids, that I felt I just had to be really sort of faithful to what happened and just sort of let the story unfold. And I think chronology really is your sort of greatest friend when you're sort of telling stories like this. That I think a lot of writers try to struggle against chronology and do flashbacks and cut-ins and all that stuff. And really, I think over time, I think you learn to understand that it actually works in your favor, that all stories unspool naturally. And sometimes I think you just have to let the story have its own lead, it's a bit like sort of like riding a horse, and, you give a horse sort of free rein and you let it run and it goes where it wants, I mean, to a kind of certain point, not to sort of bore the reader with lots of stuff, but I think, everything has a natural sort of ebb and flow, and it's sort of trying to sort of capture that without losing the reader. So that was a challenge,
When I was talking with David Grant about Killers of the Flower Moon and how he was able to, and how he's constantly able in his long magazine pieces and books to create suspense and drama in what's already ossified as a nonfiction true account, he's echoed exactly what you just said, that chronology is your friend, and let the story play out through their eyes in that chronology. Like, they don't know certain things, at point A, they don't know point C yet, even though you as the author know it. So you let the story just play out in that sense, and then they're discovering things as you go, and it creates this natural progression of suspense and tension. And that's kind of exactly what you're alluding to.
One of the things when you try to write through the sort of point of view of your characters, I think there's a natural suspense in particularly in sort of gang life and that type of thing. I mean, there's moments like when you're elated, there's moments like when you're scared. So I think it's sort of finding those key points in like people's stories, and then sort of using that to stop the action or start the action at those points. I mean, I think particularly with Shug, for example, on the Thanksgiving Day shooting, I mean, he had no idea what was going to happen when he went sort of down on the field and sort of opened fire. So he was starting to run things through his mind at that point. So I think that's a natural time when there's a element of suspense there which you don't have to manufacture. And I think there's times as a writer when you really want to sort of manufacture some big sort of cliffhanger or suspense, and you might sort of take a scene which doesn't have the power to do that and sort of overwrite it. And I sort of learned that sort of early on, like with magazine work, that don't try to falsely sort of manufacture suspense because it never works. It has to have a natural point to where it evolves. So I think it's just sort of finding those points in the story.
Yeah, and the other thing too, if things are naturally suspenseful and fraught with their own kind of drama, to just kind of let that take its course and let that generate its own momentum too.
Yes, and I think that goes back to doing really deep research. I mean, it's very often, like you might read other people's work and, because they haven't researched it like thoroughly, they're trying to, build sort of stuff out of material which is sort of simply not there. So I think, that's why I go very heavy on the research portion, because if that's down well, then you're going to have enough material where you don't have to sort of manipulate it too much in order to get the effect that you want, but you have to work really well with your subjects in order to sort of find that.
Mm-hmm. Were there any particular influential books that you had read or reread that helped inform the work you did with Sex, Money, Murder?
Let me think. Gosh, I mean, I read all the time. I mean, I found actually recently I can't read much fiction anymore. I always used to, read like loads and loads of it. So I used to love stories sort of telling in that way, because you're not sort of bound by any rules, when you're making things up, and the writing can be very lavish and extravagant, because you're not sort of bound by facts. But, sort of working on this, you want to, I mean, the facts were sort of strong enough, they didn't need much sort of embellishment. So, I mean, I love sort of writers like David Grann. Krakauer, I think, is amazing, and just he researches, very, very well, so that like what's on the page is a strong. Tracy Kidder, I read a lot of, and I try to sort of stay away from like true crime stuff as much as I could, because it is like a book about crime, but it's much more sort of social history. It's much more about these guys' lives, and they were involved in crime. So I avoided watching things like The Wire or immersing myself in a lot of sort of crime stuff, really.
And when you were writing the book, you had your research and you're getting down to the writing, what was your daily routine as you were looking to get into that flow, that generative flow through the first few drafts?
Oh God, I hate the first drafts, and it's so painful. My God, geez, I'd rather rub like glass in my eyes. It's just it never comes out right. I mean, I think I've got like 2 young kids, so I've had to, like before I had kids, I would not speak to anyone in the morning and just have coffee and sit down and write. But these days I can't really do that. So, I sort of drive the kids into school, and then I'd sort of come back, and I'd have to have a sort of half an hour or an hour or so where I'm just sort of, clearing out of everything. So so when I'd structure chapters, and roughly where that chapter was going to go, and then I'd start sort of writing it around sort of 10 or 11. And I really only have a sort of few hours in me on the writing side, so I do like 3, 4, maybe 5 hours at most, and then I'd sort of stop at like 2 o'clock or so, something like that. And then I'd, read back to what I wrote in the evening, and then start again in the morning, I mean, I think there's only a sort of certain sort of period of time when you can sort of concentrate, because it requires so much concentration to put this down on the page accurately that, like I can't sort of write at night. I know sort of other people who do, but I can't. It always has to be early in the morning if I can. I mean, earlier the better,
Right. So is there any other sort of tactics you use in terms of how you're setting up your desk so you can like access things, apps, or do you turn off the internet? Like, what does that look like so you do have that very sort of arrowhead focus?
Well, I had a big sort of pinboard with cards on it.
Oh, I love it.
With sort of lines and color sort of coded cards, and then that was sort of split up into sort of 3 acts, so which are the sort of 3 acts of the book. So anytime I was writing, I could turn and sort of look back at a particular date or a time, and so you have it on your card when this sort of key moment happens in this character's life. And so that then informs how you write a particular scene, because you're referring back to something that may have happened. So that sort of board was incredibly sort of useful. I mean, yes, I tried to keep my desk clear and all that stuff, but actually, like, there was one time, and I had this, this giant board with cards on it, and my daughter had come in my office in the evening, and she'd pulled out all the pins holding in all the cards. Literally, like, probably 100 cards and all their stuff, and it had been so beautifully laid out and meticulous, and they were all in a pile on the floor with a nice neat pile of drawing pins next to them. And she said, "Daddy, look, I've sort of tied it all up for you."
And you're like, "You ruined my book."
Yes, I know. I went, "Oh, that's lovely." And I just sort of put my head in my hands, and it took like a week to get it back to how it was.
And before I let you get out of here, Jonathan, I wanted to maybe ask you about maybe some advice you might give. It's funny. Some people ask, like, what would you give to advice to a younger person? And the fact is, like, a younger person, like, probably won't listen to it anyway. Maybe the people who would most listen to it are perhaps people who are maybe mid-career, maybe low to mid-30s, mid to late 30s, who might be a bit stuck, who have some talent, but things aren't just hitting a certain level of visibility and so forth. And I wonder, maybe through your experience and anything, what might you tell someone like that who's a bit stuck with ability and is just having a hard time getting that breakthrough?
Well, I think often, you don't have any control over what happens externally. Like you have no control over, if your book's going to be a sort of breakout at a particular time, or whether a particular editor working on a particular magazine is going to be sympathetic to your story ideas. But what you do have control over is the quality of your work. And I think just sort of focusing on that, as much as you can, and just sort of taking like enormous pride in like what you do, because, not just one book is going to define you, not just one like magazine piece will. But I think over time you start to sort of build up a body of work, and oftentimes some of the pieces I've done, which weren't published in the most prestigious places, are the ones I love the most. And the stuff that is published in magazines where you have a high audience and they're meant to be high visibility and stuff, are not the pieces I'm the most kind of proud of. So, I just don't think that you should sort of set the bar at what other people think of your work. I know that's really difficult. And I think all your work has to appeal commercially in some sense. But I think, just sort of take pride in what you're doing, because it's anyone who knows this world knows it's really, really difficult. And, you have to put your hand on your heart and say, I did my best,
Yeah, Glenn Stout says, like, really the only thing you can control is your effort. And then that's it.
Yeah, I mean, that's all you can do. And how people receive it or what they think of it. And, there's a very sort of fine line between a book, sort of being a breakout, or a book that, being really, really good. That's probably better than what's sort of commercially successful. So, just like, don't be sort of too hard on yourself, because I think, we as writers tend to be really sort of hard on ourselves and have a bit of doubt, and, try not to have that. Just like to let the work have a natural flow and enjoy it.
Fantastic. Well, Jonathan, to be respectful of your time, I'll let you get out of here. This was a ton of fun. Where can people find you online, and more about your latest book and your work in general?
Yes, of course. So I have a website, JonathanGreenOnline.com. Sex, Money, Murder is out. It's been out about a month. It's available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and independent stores. And my first book, Murder in the High Himalaya, is also available everywhere. And send me an email. I mean, if anyone has any questions or they'd like to know more, I'm at mail@JonathanGreenOnline.com, which is a bit of a mouthful, but like, that's where I am.
Fantastic. I'll link all that stuff up in the show notes, Jonathan. Thanks again for your time. Best of luck with the book, and we'll be in touch. Maybe get you on for a round 2 sometime down the road.
Thanks, Brendan. I really enjoyed it, actually.
Fantastic
Stuff. Yeah, very cool.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jonathan. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. Well, at long last, we've come to the end. Thank you for listening, and thank you to Jonathan for his time. Before you go on about your day, would you be so kind as to consider leaving a review of the podcast on Apple Podcasts? I'd love to see us get to 100 ratings or reviews, and we're almost halfway. It just takes a few moments, but those few moments help immeasurably and really echo into the future in ways that'll help the podcast sustain itself and keep going. Also, if you head over to BrendanO'Meara.com, not only will you find show notes for the episodes, but you'll also be able to sign up for my monthly reading list newsletter. In it, I share my reading recommendations for the month and what you might have missed from the world of the podcast. Once a month, no spam, can't beat it. Go ahead and follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Brendan O'Meara, and follow the podcast at CNFpod on Twitter and at CNF Podcast on Facebook. You can also email me if you have any questions or concerns. If you're struggling with your work, I'd love to help you out. So, it's been a while since I tried to get my wife to subscribe to the podcast. And you know what she said?
Rather rub like glass in my eyes. It's just...
All right. We'll see you right back here next Friday. Have a CNF and great week, friends.